Elias Thorne was a man who hated noise. A professional silence consultant, he made his living soundproofing the homes of the paranoid and the ultra-rich. He believed that if you could control the air, you could control the soul. But Elias had a secret. He was losing his hearing. A degenerative condition was turning the world into a muffled, watery blur. Desperate for a sanctuary, he purchased Blackwood Manor, an isolated estate in the foggy valleys of Vermont. The house was famous for its architectural perfection, walls built of dense, ancient limestone that supposedly absorbed all sound. When Elias moved in, the silence was heavenly. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. On his third night, he sat in the center of the grand library, sipping tea. He dropped his spoon. It hit the marble floor with a sharp clack. Elias waited for the sound to fade, but it didn't. Exactly 10 seconds later, the clack happened again. Elias looked around. There was no one there. 10 seconds later, clack. He stood up, his heart quickening. "Who's there?" he called out. 10 seconds later, the house replied in his own voice, perfectly replicated. "Who's there?" Elias froze. He didn't speak again. He waited. 10 seconds passed. "Who's there?" the house repeated. It was an audio loop, but it wasn't a mechanical glitch. The sound wasn't getting quieter, it was getting sharper. Every time the house repeated his voice, it sounded more aggressive, more distorted. He realized with horror that the walls of Blackwood Manor weren't absorbing sound, they were storing it. The limestone was a battery for every vibration ever made within its walls. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the loop. It wasn't his voice. It was a woman's scream, shrill and agonizing. It sounded like it was coming from inside the very stones of the fireplace. The scream cut off. 10 seconds later, it ripped through the room again. Elias ran for the front door, but as he grabbed the handle, he heard a whisper right against his ear, a whisper that had been trapped in the house for 100 years. "Don't let them hear you breathe, Elias. If they hear you, they can find you." Elias pressed his back against the heavy oak door, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. He stared at the empty hallway, terrified to make a sound. But even his silence was a failure. Hiss, hiss, hiss. 10 seconds after his last panic breath, the house mimicked the sound of his lungs. It was louder now, amplified by the limestone walls. The house was building a symphony of his fear. He realized the mechanical cruelty of the layering. If he screamed, he would hear that scream every 10 seconds for the rest of his life. If he fought, the sound of the struggle would become the permanent background of his existence. Elias needed to find the dead zone, a place where the limestone didn't reach. He moved through the house with the grace of a ghost, stepping only on the rugs, his hands tucked into his pockets to prevent his clothes from rustling. He reached the basement stairs. Down there, the walls were raw earth and wood. Silence might actually mean silence there. But as he descended, the air grew cold, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made his teeth ache. In the corner of the cellar, he saw them, the static people. They weren't solid. They looked like the flickering snow on an old television set, human-shaped distortions in the air. They were huddled around an old brass phonograph that was spinning without a needle. One of the entities turned its head. It had no face, only a jagged hole where a mouth should be, pulsing with the rhythm of the clack, clack, clack from the library upstairs. The entity let out a sound, not a voice, but a burst of white noise. It was the sound of 1,000 radio stations playing at once. Elias covered his ears, but the sound didn't come from the air. It resonated through his skull. The static people didn't see him. They tuned into him. "I have to stop the loop," Elias whispered to himself. A mistake he realized the moment the words left his lips. 10 seconds later, his own whisper boomed through the basement like a megaphone. "I have to stop the loop." The static people stood up in unison. Their flickering bodies grew brighter, fed by the energy of his voice. They began to move toward him, their footsteps making a sound like sandpaper on glass. Elias scrambled back up the stairs, but the house was ready. The clack of the spoon, the woman's scream, and his own whispers were now overlapping into a wall of sound. He lunged for his soundproofing kit in the hallway, grabbing a roll of industrial acoustic foam. If he could cover his mouth, or the walls, he might stand a chance. But then, the woman's voice returned. This time, it wasn't a scream. It was a cold, clear sentence that stopped him cold. Elias, look behind the wallpaper in the nursery. We are all still talking in there. Elias sprinted to the second floor, his heart drumming a rhythm that the house began to mimic 10 seconds later. A rhythmic, fleshy thump-thump that echoed from the floorboards. He reached the nursery, a room he had avoided because of its suffocating, oppressive stillness. He grabbed a utility knife from his belt and slashed at the floral Victorian wallpaper. As the paper peeled away in damp strips, Elias's blood ran cold. The walls weren't just limestone. They were covered in microscopic, spiraling grooves, etched with surgical precision into the stone. The entire room was a giant, hollowed-out cylinder of a phonograph record. Every inch of the house was designed to catch, hold, and replay. "Who did this?" he hissed. "Who did this?" The room snarled back 10 seconds later, the acoustics of a nursery turning his voice into something jagged and sharp. "I did," a voice rasped. Elias spun around. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked more like a shadow than a human. He was skeletal, wearing tattered clothes that looked 50 years out of date. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, but the most terrifying thing was his mouth, or the lack of it. His lips had been sewn shut with thick, black upholstery thread. The man held a small chalkboard. On it, he wrote with trembling fingers, "I am Benjamin. Do not vibrate." Benjamin pointed to his own throat, then to the walls. He leaned in and grabbed Elias's hand, pulling him toward a small, soundproof closet lined with heavy wool blankets, the only quiet box left in the manor. Once inside, Benjamin cut the threads on his lips with a jagged fingernail. He didn't speak. He whistled a low, flat tone that didn't trigger the house's sensors. "The house is a memory vessel," Benjamin whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Built by a mad scientist named Dr. Elias Thorne, your ancestor, Elias. He didn't want his family to die, so he built a house that would keep their voices alive forever. But voices need energy. They eat the silence. They eat us." Benjamin pulled back his sleeve. His skin was translucent, and beneath it, Elias could see sound waves moving like worms under the flesh. "The static people, they're the ones who spoke too much," Benjamin warned. "They became the noise. If the house captures your perfect frequency, it will strip the meat from your bones to feed the loop." Suddenly, the closet door vibrated. Outside, the woman's scream from part 1 had evolved. It was no longer just a sound. It was a physical force, rattling the door on its hinges. The woman's voice spoke again, sounding exactly like Elias's late mother. "Elias, baby, why are you hiding in the dark? Come out and tell me you love me. I need to hear the words." Benjamin's eyes filled with tears. "Don't answer," he mouthed. "It's not her. It's the feedback loop." The house began to hum a low, subsonic frequency that made Elias's nose start to bleed. The grooves in the walls were beginning to glow with a dull, friction-generated heat. The house was hungry for a new recording. Elias pressed his hands over his ears, but it was useless. The sound wasn't coming through the air. It was vibrating through his skeleton. The subsonic hum grew into a roar, a deep, churning brown noise that made his vision blur. "It's searching," Benjamin whispered, his eyes darting toward the closet door. "The house is scanning you. It's looking for the resonance." "What resonance?" Elias gasped, his head thumping. "The one sound you can't hold back," Benjamin replied, his voice trembling. "The sound of your greatest regret. The house isn't just a recorder, Elias. It's an inquisitor." Suddenly, the screaming and the static stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then, a new sound began to play. Not from the walls, but from the floorboards beneath them. It was the sound of a hospital heart monitor. Beep, beep, beep. Elias's breath hitched. That was the sound of his father's final hours 3 years ago. Elias, his father's voice, frail and wheezing, filled the closet. "Why didn't you come? I called you for hours. I just wanted to hear your voice one last time. Why were you so silent?" "It's not him," Elias choked out, tears stinging his eyes. "He died in Chicago. This house couldn't have hurt him. It doesn't need to have hurt him. Benjamin hissed, grabbing Elias's shoulders. "It's reading the electrical impulses in your brain. It's synthesizing your guilt. It wants you to scream, 'I'm sorry.' It wants that peak frequency." The monitor on the floorboard sped up. Beep, 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 beep. The sound of a man gasping for air, the death rattle, echoed with agonizing clarity. It was the one sound Elias had spent years trying to drown out with his silence consulting work. Outside the closet, the static people began to hum in harmony with the heart monitor. The white noise grew rhythmic, forming a choir of static that chanted Elias's name. "Elias, Elias, speak to us." The walls of the closet began to crack. The grooves in the limestone were glowing cherry red now. The heat was becoming unbearable. The house was a pressure cooker, and Elias's guilt was the fuel. I have to tell him," Elias sobbed, his resolve crumbling. "I have to say it. If you speak," Benjamin warned, pulling a shard of glass from his pocket, "you become a permanent track on the record. You'll be the static that haunts the next person who buys this house." Elias opened his mouth. His lungs were full of a 3-year-old apology, a scream of grief that had been soundproofed for too long. Just as the first syllable began to form in his throat, Benjamin did the unthinkable. He didn't cover Elias's mouth. He slammed the shard of glass into the acoustic foam of the wall, creating a horrific, ear-splitting screech of friction. The house recoiled. The perfect frequency was interrupted by a chaotic, discordant noise it couldn't map. The heart monitor sound shattered. The voice of Elias's father distorted into a digital growl and faded. "The house hates static it didn't create," Benjamin panted, blood leaking from his own ears. "But we've only bought ourselves minutes. The house is going to reset the loop, and when it resets, it clears the dust from the grooves." "What does that mean?" Elias asked, his voice shaking. Benjamin looked at the door. "It means the house is going to purge everything that isn't a sound." The air in the closet didn't just vibrate, it began to atomize. Elias watched in horror as a wooden chair in the corner of the nursery literally turned into sawdust, the molecules shaken apart by a frequency so high it was beyond human hearing. "The purge has started," Benjamin hissed, his eyes wide with manic energy. "The house is cleaning the record. If we don't reach the master needle in the attic, we'll be nothing but gray powder by morning." They burst out of the closet and into the hallway. But the hallway was no longer a path. It was the gallery of whispers. Thousands of tiny, glowing grooves in the walls were spinning like invisible gears. As they ran, the air became thick with voices. Not screams this time, but the low, insidious sound of Elias's own lies. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," his own voice whispered from a wall sconce. "I love you, Sarah. I'm not seeing anyone else," his voice echoed from the floorboards. "No, Dad. The doctor says you're getting better. You'll be home by Christmas." Each lie was a different frequency. Each one felt like a physical weight pressing against Elias's chest. The static people were no longer just watching. They were vibrating in sync with the lies, their flickering bodies becoming solid enough to block the path. "Don't listen," Benjamin shouted, though his own voice was being drowned out by a recording of a woman crying. "It's using your dishonesty to create a phase shift. If you believe the lies, you'll stay trapped in the frequency." Elias stumbled. He saw a static figure in the shape of his ex-fiancée, Sarah. She wasn't made of light. She was made of the sound of her own heartbreak, the sobbing, the shattered glass, the slamming doors. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Elias yelled. 10 seconds later, the house mocked him. "I'm sorry, Sarah?" The sound hit him like a physical blow, knocking him against the wall. The grooves in the limestone began to cut into his jacket, trying to pull his flesh into the record. "It's not real, Elias," Benjamin roared, grabbing him by the collar. "The master needle is behind the great clock in the attic. It's the only thing that isn't stone. It's the diamond tip that reads the house." They scrambled up the final flight of stairs. The attic door was vibrating so violently it looked blurred. Behind it, a sound like 1,000 jet engines was spooling up. Elias looked at Benjamin. The man was fading. Because Benjamin had lived in silence for so long, he had no volume left. He was becoming a shadow, "I can't go in there," Benjamin whispered, his body turning translucent. "I'm a quiet. I'll be erased instantly." "You have the volume, Elias. You have the guilt. You have to be the one to break the needle." Elias pushed the door open. In the center of the attic stood a massive, vertical pillar of rotating obsidian. At its top was a single, glowing diamond needle that moved across the ceiling, which was spinning like a gargantuan vinyl record. The sound here was absolute. It wasn't noise anymore. It was pure power. Standing in front of the needle was the Dr. Elias Thorne, or what was left of him. He was a creature of pure, vibrating gold light, his body made of a million overlapping echoes of his own name. "The symphony is almost complete, Elias." The doctor's voice resonated in Elias's very marrow. "I just need the sound of a thorn finally telling the truth." The attic was a cathedral of kinetic energy. The giant obsidian pillar, the master needle, spun with such velocity that the air around it had turned into a shimmering blue-white plasma. The ceiling of the manor, a vast disk of grooved limestone, rotated above them with a low, tectonic growl. The golden figure of Dr. Elias Thorne didn't walk. He rippled. He was a human-shaped feedback loop, a man who had successfully turned himself into a permanent frequency. "Look at them, Elias," the doctor's voice boomed, vibrating through Elias's teeth. He gestured toward the edges of the attic. From the shadows, sound ghosts began to emerge. They weren't like the static people. They were vivid, color-saturated memories of the Thorne family. Elias saw his grandmother humming a lullaby. He saw his uncle laughing. They looked alive, but their movements were repetitive, trapped in a 5-second loop of perfect happiness. "I have preserved them," Elias declared, "but they are thin. They lack the depth of truth. To make them fully solid, to bring your father back from the silence, the house needs a master track. It needs a confession of such raw, honest agony that it can jumpstart the resurrection." Elias looked at the needle. A phantom image of his father began to coalesce near the obsidian pillar. The image was flickering, gasping, reaching out for a hand that wasn't there. "Tell the needle the truth you've been hiding from yourself," the doctor commanded. "Tell it why you really became a silence consultant. Tell it why you let your father die alone. If the vibration is pure enough, he will step off the record and into your arms." Elias's legs shook. The temptation was a physical weight. I just wanted it to be quiet," he whispered. "I just wanted it to be quiet." The house roared back, the needle pulsing with a hungry, violet light. "No," the doctor hissed. "Deeper. The truth you soundproofed in the basement of your soul." Elias looked at the flickering ghost of his father. He remembered the night of the death. He hadn't just missed the call. He had seen the phone vibrating on the nightstand. He had seen Dad flashing on the screen, and he had turned the phone face down. He had been so exhausted by his father's long illness, so drained by the constant noise of suffering, that he had chosen a single hour of silence over his father's last words. The guilt surged up his throat like bile. The needle began to glow with a blinding intensity, sensing the frequency of his shame. "If I say it," Elias choked out, "he comes back. He lives forever in the loop," the doctor promised. A perfect, eternal echo. Elias realized the trap. His father wouldn't be alive. He would be a prisoner of his own dying moment, replayed for 1,000 years for the doctor's Sixth Symphony. "You don't want a family," Elias snarled, his voice cracking. "You want a collection." Elias grabbed a heavy iron wrench from his soundproofing kit. He didn't turn toward the doctor. He turned toward the diamond needle. "If I break this," Elias shouted over the roar of the house, "the music stops for everyone. You, me, and the ghosts. You'll be deaf, Elias." Elias screamed, his golden form flickering with rage. "The feedback of the shattering diamond will destroy your eardrums. You will live the rest of your life in a tomb of silence." "I've been living in a tomb of silence my whole life." Elias screamed back, "At least this time, it'll be real." Elias didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy iron wrench with every ounce of his suppressed rage and guilt. The impact with the diamond needle wasn't a dull thud. It was a cosmic catastrophe. The moment the iron hit the diamond, the master track of the house snapped. A sound shock, a physical wall of white noise, exploded from the pillar. It was a visual wave of distorted air that rippled through the attic, shattering the windows and turning the golden Dr. Elias Thorne into a screaming whirlwind of fractured glass. For Elias, the world didn't go dark. It went zero. The sound was so loud it bypassed his ears and struck his brain directly. There was a sensation of a hot needle piercing his skull, a brief, agonizing ringing, and then absolute silence. Not the quiet of a library, but the void of deep space. His eardrums were gone, turned to ribbons by the frequency. He fell to the floor, the world tilting and blurring. He couldn't hear the house collapsing, but he could feel it. The floorboards beneath him were vibrating with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. The limestone was literally shaking itself back into dust. Elias crawled through the gray powder of the attic. Without his hearing, his sense of balance was destroyed. He felt like he was walking on the deck of a sinking ship in a storm. Suddenly, a hand, cold and made of static, grabbed his ankle. He looked back. The doctor was no longer a golden god. He was a distorted screech made flesh. Though Elias couldn't hear him, he could see the man's jaw unhinging, his body flickering like a corrupted video file. The doctor was dying because his record was broken, and he was trying to drag Elias into the void with him. Elias kicked out, his foot passing through the doctor's translucent chest. He couldn't hear the man's roar, but he saw the ripples of sound in the dust on the floor. He reached the attic stairs, but they were gone. The purge had intensified. The stairs had been atomized into a slide of fine, gray silt. Elias looked at his hands. They were trembling. He realized that even though he was deaf, he could still feel the house's last stand. The limestone walls were pulsing with a final, desperate rhythm, the death rattle of Blackwood Manor. He closed his eyes and pressed his palms against the wall. He couldn't hear the way out, but he could feel the vibrations. The dead zones, where there was no limestone, felt cold and still. The active zones felt hot and humming. He began to navigate the collapsing house like a blind man in a maze of heat. But in the darkness of his own mind, a new sound began to grow. It wasn't an external noise. It was a phantom echo. Inside his head, perfectly clear, his father's voice spoke one last time. Not the house's recording, but a memory so deep it survived the shattering. Elias, the silence isn't a tomb. It's a canvas. Start drawing. The silence was a physical weight. Elias moved through the ruins of the second floor, his boots sinking into 6 inches of pulverized limestone. The air was a thick fog of gray dust, making every breath taste like ancient earth and dry bone. He was stone deaf, but his body had become a giant ear. He felt the floor vibrate under his feet, a rhythmic, aggressive thrum. The static people, without the master needle to keep them in a loop, the entities had become feral noise. They were no longer human shapes. They were jagged, flickering tears in reality, surging through the dust like sharks in gray water. They couldn't see Elias, and they couldn't hear him, but they could feel the vibration of his heartbeat. To them, Elias's heart was a drum in a dark room. He ducked behind a half-shattered marble pillar. A static entity drifted past, its body a chaotic blur of white snow. As it moved, the dust on the floor leaped into the air, dancing in complex geometric patterns, cymatics, responding to the creature's high-frequency hum. Elias watched the dust. When the entity got closer, the dust patterns became violent and jagged. When it moved away, the dust settled. I'm a lighthouse of sound, Elias realized, clutching his chest. I have to shut down. He remembered his training as a silence consultant. To block sound, you don't just add padding. You create phase cancellation. You produce a frequency that is the exact opposite of the noise to flatten the wave. He couldn't produce a sound wave, but he could control his autonomic nervous system. Elias sat cross-legged in the dust. He closed his eyes, plunging into the absolute void of his own mind. He began to slow his breathing, 4 seconds in, 8 seconds out. He focused on his heart, imagining it not as a drum, but as a smooth, still pond. Slowly, his pulse dropped. 50 beats per minute. 45, 40. A feral noise entity shivered just inches from his face. It tilted its head, its jagged mouth hole pulsing. It was listening for the thud of his blood. Elias didn't blink. He became a statue of salt and silence. The entity let out a burst of white noise. Elias felt the hair on his arms stand up from the static charge, but it didn't find him. It drifted away, its frequency fading into the distance. He had become invisible, but as he sat in the deep meditation, something shifted. In the absence of external sound, his brain began to hallucinate noise to fill the vacuum. This was the Charles Bonnet syndrome of the ear. He didn't hear voices. He heard the house's blueprint. The vibrations through the floor began to form a map in his mind. He could feel the layout of the foundation. He felt a hollow space beneath the grand foyer, a hidden chamber that wasn't made of limestone, but of lead. The master record storage. If he could reach the lead chamber, he would be safe from the purge. But the map in his head showed something else. The doctor's distorted spirit was already there, trying to fuse itself with the final, unshattered records to reborn itself. Elias moved like a shadow through the wreckage. He didn't use his eyes. He followed the pressure in his chest. The manor was no longer a house. It was a dying organism, and the foyer was its throat. He found the trapdoor beneath a pile of pulverized marble. It was heavy, lined with thick, dull lead. Lead was the enemy of vibration, the ultimate sound killer. As Elias descended the narrow ladder, the phantom humming in his bones stopped. For the first time since entering Blackwood Manor, he felt a peace that wasn't forced. It was the silence of the grave. The vault was a small, circular room. In the center sat a primitive, hand-cranked device holding a single wax cylinder. This was the alpha track. Elias reached out to touch the wax, but the air in the room suddenly curdled. A shape began to stitch itself together from the shadows. It was the doctor, but he was no longer golden or even static. He was a void, a man-shaped hole in reality that sucked in light and air. Elias couldn't hear the doctor scream, but he felt the pressure drop so sharply his nose began to bleed again. The doctor lunged, his hands like cold vacuum. He didn't want to kill Elias. He wanted to inhabit him. He needed a body with a heartbeat to act as a new metronome for his symphony. Elias backed away, his hands hitting the wax cylinder player. He realized why this record was kept in lead. It wasn't just a recording, it was the source code. He looked at the wax and saw the name etched into the rim. Clara, 1892. The doctor's daughter. The first voice he had ever trapped. The doctor paused, his void-like form flickering with a strange, rhythmic grief. Elias grabbed the crank of the player. He didn't have to break the record. He just had to play it backwards. He knew the physics of sound, phase inversion. If he played the alpha track in reverse, it would create a mathematical anti-sound that would cancel out the doctor's existence and collapse the house's acoustic field once and for all. But the doctor knew it too. He surged forward, his fingers clawing at Elias's throat. Elias felt the air being pulled from his lungs. His vision began to spark. With his last ounce of strength, he slammed his palm against the crank and spun it counterclockwise. The wax cylinder began to turn. Elias felt a sensation like the world being turned inside out. Because he was deaf, he didn't hear the reverse scream of a century-old ghost. He felt a vacuum collapse. The air in the vault didn't just go still, it vanished. The pressure from the collapsing sound field began to pull the walls of the vault inward. The doctor's void form began to unravel like a loose sweater. He was being unspoken, his frequency canceled out by his own daughter's inverted voice. As the doctor dissolved into nothingness, the vault began to buckle under the weight of the house above. The lead walls, once a sanctuary, were now a coffin. Elias slumped against the lead floor. He couldn't hear the ceiling cracking. He couldn't hear his own ragged breathing. He just closed his eyes and waited for the final, silent clack of the record reaching its end. The rescue workers found Elias Thorne 3 days later, buried beneath 10 feet of pulverized limestone and lead. They expected to find a corpse. Instead, they found a man sitting perfectly still in a pocket of air, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his dust-caked lips. Elias was alive, but the world he returned to was unrecognizable. The surgeons confirmed it. His eardrums were gone beyond repair. He was clinically deaf. But as Elias walked out of the hospital and into the bustling streets of Burlington, he didn't feel disabled. He felt attuned. The absolute silence he had feared for years was not an empty void. It was a symphony of touch. He could feel the rumble of a distant subway through the soles of his feet. He could feel the high-frequency whir of a hummingbird's wings as a pressure against his cheek. Most importantly, he could feel the vibrations of people. When someone lied to him, their chest tightened, creating a jagged, discordant rhythm he could sense from 3 feet away. When they were happy, their resonance was smooth and melodic like a cello. Elias returned to his work as a silence consultant, but he renamed his firm the Resonance Studio. He no longer sold foam padding or lead shields. Instead, he taught people how to listen with their skin. He helped the grieving find the echo of their loved ones not in ghosts, but in the objects they left behind. The way a wooden table still holds the vibration of a family dinner, or how a ring carries the warmth of a life lived. One afternoon, Elias returned to the site of Blackwood Manor. The forest had already begun to reclaim the ruins. The limestone dust had mixed with the rain, turning into a rich, gray soil where wildflowers were blooming in concentric circles, cymatic patterns created by the earth's own natural home. He knelt and pressed his palm to the ground. He didn't hear a scream. He didn't hear a loop. He felt the slow, tectonic heartbeat of the planet, a deep and ancient OM that no architect could ever record. In the center of the ruins, he found a small piece of the broken diamond needle, smoothed by the elements into a pebble. He picked it up and held it to his chest. It didn't vibrate with guilt anymore. It was just a stone. Elias realized that the doctor's mistake wasn't wanting to remember. It was wanting to possess the sound. You cannot own a vibration. You can only be part of it while it passes through you. He looked up at the sky. He couldn't hear the wind in the trees, but he could feel the air singing across the leaves. For the first time in his life, Elias Thorne wasn't running from the noise. He was finally perfectly in tune.